Welcome, humans and future sentient silicon beings, to the fourth age with Noah and Marty. Today, we're going to dig deeper into the alignment problem, which we covered a few episodes ago. I'm going to be with you, the listeners, while Noah teaches us the deeper mathematics of the alignment problem. Noah?
Yeah, well, so alignment is essentially the fundamental problem of these machines because what they're doing is programming themselves to some specification. And as a programmer yourself, you understand how fundamentally difficult it is to get programs written in languages that you understand to do what you want them to do.
Yeah, this morning I was having trouble with that. Damn it.
Right, yeah. It's rather amusing if you read back in the histories, back in the 40s and the 50s, before computers really existed, there was a great deal of confidence in the mathematical community that programming computers was going to be easy. Because after all, once you built a machine that just did whatever you told it to do, obviously all you would have to do is tell it things and it would do them. The hard part.
I recall during the space program, there was something about there was a contract, I think maybe with the Apollo missions or something, maybe the Mercury ones, and they said the hardware, you're bidding for the hardware, and of course the software's free.
Yeah. There's also the famous story of how Sun got started. They basically ripped off the Berkeley, shared delusion BSD Unix, lock, stock, and barrel. When when the when the school's attorneys came to see whether or not there was any IP, they had them physically open up the computer towers they were working on, and since the contents of the computer towers were off the shelf, uh, you know, microchips and hard drives and so on that were commercially available, the lawyers said, "Yep, no intellectual property in there," and closed the computer up and walked away.
Case closed.
Yes. So it turns out that it is, in fact, extremely difficult to actually ask questions in ways that are straightforward or comprehensible. Um, and so that's the sort of first layer of this mathematics is first off understanding information from a communication standpoint. And so we're going to get into Shannon information and the conception of information as a sequence of answers to questions. And what makes this fun is that the questions don't actually matter very much because there's a lot of sets of equivalent questions. So we had gone over earlier how there's sort of multiple Venn diagrams that I happen to be sitting in the center of. And so when you eliminate people that have no interest in culture and no interest in the economy and no interest in computational mathematics and no interest in sort of, political science, you sort of eventually get rid of everybody that isn't me. And that's why I'm thinking about these things, and it doesn't seem like there's much of anybody else that is. It's not that there's nothing interesting within these pursuits of greater specificity. It's just that if we're going to exploit these technologies, we're going to have to exploit them in ways that are actually useful to us. And so while you can get down to me by doing that, you could also get down to me by doing geographic things of people who've lived in Charlottesville for more than 40 years and some other things that would also pretty rapidly converge on me. And the important thing is, from a Shannon information perspective, the number of questions it's going to take to converge on a piece of information is actually a quantifiably measurable thing. And while you can take more if you want to, whatever the smallest number is for anything that you care to imagine, that number can't be made smaller through yes or no questions in any way that gets you ahead of the game. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it's very much an entropy type of measure, and it turns out that it's in fact, for most physical systems, exactly analogous to entropy. And so we can think about this the same way that we engineer entropy in physical systems, where our heat pumps, for example, are effectively moving entropy around to stick energy in order to cool the inside of our homes while heating up the outside of our homes. Um, that's the basic perspective. If we want our AI systems to make sense, we're going to have to design them in a universe that we don't have sort of full comprehension of, to input energy into those systems to create a internal zone inside the AI that makes sense in some understandable fashion, that exists at this relatively low entropy, at the cost of expending that energy and externalizing, nonsense. Some of which will be the fact that we will find these things basically impenetrable, that we don't know what it's how it's actually doing what it's doing. So that's the
Okay, so you're expending energy to put in the middle, sort of like a house. We're making it cooler. The outside we're making hotter, or you're trying to pull into the middle the simplest set of questions to get to an answer, and everything else stays on the outside.
well, from a mathematical perspective, that's actually what training neural networks is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And the house in this metaphor, the structure of that house is down to the reward algorithm. So basically, one thing, these things are occasionally called is programming by example. So it has some kind of reward function, some kind of way to figure out whether or not what it just did was okay or not okay, which it then propagates back into itself to try to become more okay or less not okay in the future. And so it is the structure of that decision algorithm that actually defines what the shape of this low entropy zone is going to be. Okay, so once we've wrapped our heads around that, the second question is, what about human intention? And this gets very tricky because, of course, we can't open up people's heads. So in sort of orthodox economics, we come up with the concept that the only thing that we can do is look at what actions human beings actually undertake and assume that if people are doing something, they're doing it for their own good reason. Obviously, this isn't universally okay. Compulsions exist that might require us to go a little deeper. If you hand a suitcase of cash over to somebody in exchange for your child, that's not a voluntary action.
This reminds me of the prisoner's dilemma as well.
Well, we'll sort of get to there, because game theory lets us start quantifying these sorts of interests. So the prisoner's dilemma is a very specific set of co-interests. We have two prisoners, each of whom can either betray or cooperate with the other prisoner without knowing what the other prisoner is going to do. The problem with the prisoner's dilemma as a model for how we actually execute justice is that if you set yourself up where bad people will be put into situations where they're effectively punished for betraying one another, then what you will do is you will evolutionarily produce situations where they will have a code of silence that snitches get stitches, that they will form gangs in defense. And so actually, uh, gang behavior is a natural consequence of setting up your policing around this sort of betrayal based uh, uh, seeking of self incrimination. Um, and so that gets into the essential thing because while human beings may or may not have a conscience, most people seem to, but there's a large enough fraction of us that don't, that it's fairly dangerous, and we need to set up systems to protect ourselves. There's no evidence that these machines have consciences, and so using the kinds of scenarios that we use on each other that are to great extent leaning on simple facts about us, that we have self-preservation instincts, most of us have consciences, we're mortal, so when you screw up, eventually the person dies anyway, and then they stop.
And when you say consciousness, you're also implying, I think, a shared set of values.
Yes, but even without a shared set of values, conscience may well still have some sort of sway.
Uh-huh.
Uh, the there are some truly dehumanizing and inhumanizing tales of conquest throughout history. One of the most horrifying runs was Genghis Khan's, where they would literally burn entire cities to the ground and put up pyramids of human skulls. But nevertheless, one of his advisors was able to put forward the notion that, while obviously it's fun to murder every man and rape every woman in a city, uh, that still you could gain greater benefit and pleasure from just enslaving all of them, or just ruling over all of them. You don't even have to enslave them. You can just be so many classes above them that it's irrelevant, like what their social status as citizens is, and that you could just take over entire continents, which of course he did,
Yeah.
and indeed, very little in the way of shared values with most people or with those being ruled over, but still this capacity to understand the existence of a future and a place within that future still creates the opportunity for certain kinds of behaviors that very fortunate, because Alexander's, Napoleon's, Genghis's, that these people have and do exist, and they could have killed many more people than they actually did. And while our existing computer programs are at a very low level of capacity, that can change quite rapidly, and obviously plugging them into the kinds of systems that do not have safety valves that allow us to deal with leaders capable of continent scale organization. Some of them are better than others. There's a story about George Washington. We didn't have term limits on the presidency until after FDR finally died. But nevertheless, we never had a president go over 2 terms because George Washington had set the social precedent that you didn't really stick around in the job. You sort of got finished and went home. There's a story that Napoleon heard that George Washington had stepped down voluntarily from running the country, and declared that he was the best man in the world for being able to do that. And of course, there's also the Roman Cincinnatus, which is who is very highly regarded as a statesman for his ability to quit. Uh, but back to computers. So they're going to they're going to optimize the boundary structure that we make available to them, and so by arranging a game theoretic situation as their boundary condition, we can then understand their relationships in a quantitative manner. Um, but this requires a sort of a n plus one order thinking, where n is the number of participants in the game, to examine what the long-term consequences of being participants in this game looks like for evaluation. And so that's where things get complicated. So my approach is actually around coordination or cooperative games, not competitive games like Prisoner's Dilemma, because it's basically too easy to develop evil strategies for evil behavior. Now, just to digress momentarily, are you familiar with tit for tat?
I don't know.
So tit for tat is an extremely dominant strategy in the space of the prisoner's dilemma. There's people that do studies where they actually have entities following various strategies, blindly playing prisoner's dilemma against one another in various random configurations. And the way tit for tat works is you're nice, and then after you've actually played a game with somebody, you return whatever behavior you received. So if the other person's nice, then you're nice the next time. If the other person was nasty, then you're nasty the next time. And that's just it. You're just whatever they did last time is whatever you do next time. So you could be nice, and somebody could betray you, and then you could betray them, and then when they're nice to you, and then you would be nice to them, and they could betray you, and that would be a stable relationship that could evolve between two people that were following this, but the first one was nice first, and the second one was nasty first. The reason tit for tat works out very well is because Prisoner's Dilemma is usually structured in such a way that the worst outcome is the double betrayal. And so the benefits that are gained from avoiding double betrayal situations with people that are either naive or also doing tit for tat or whatever is so great that the costs that get incurred by other strategies which do double betray more often get crushed. Now, it is the case that there are very sophisticated group strategies that, given a set of meta rules about how the games are being conducted, can allow the existence of a subculture, if you will. So under the right circumstances, it's possible to deploy a fraction of the group that has some sort of identification coding strategy where they will figure out whether or not the other person's a member of the group, and then behave in ways that are very specifically group supportive oriented, and or very specifically out group disoriented, and those systems can beat tit for tat, but those systems are rules dependent. So if you if you have a game where you are going to play 10 sequential games against a random opponent, and then go away and then be assigned a new random opponent, and you're going to never repeat against any opponent, then there might be one particular one of those that you can come up with. But then if you change the rules so that it's going to go around and around a few times or something else like that, then those rule changes will be enough that if you're stuck with a fixed strategy, then your sort of in group can be destroyed by these rule changes, and tit for tat will sort of beat them in the new rule sets. So there's a little bit of subtlety there going on.
So the goal here is for any one individual to increase the chance that they'll be successful, possibly while potentially decreasing the chance that someone outside your secret handshake group will be successful.
Sort of. So the way to think about this is in terms of this metaspace. So it's hard to sort of lift your head up into this n+1 point of view. But the goal of these strategies is to work out a way for the strategy to maximize the number of points that it gets.
Right.
And so tit for tat is sort of situation portable, and it maximizes the number of points that it gets by maximizing the individual's points across multiple situations.
Mm-hmm.
These other strategies can maximize points greater than tit for tat does across its individuals. So I've got a team of 10 people, you've got a team of 10 people, you put tit for tat on your 10, and they all do very well. I come up with some sort of exploitative meta strategy for mine, and my 10 get more points than your 10 get. Maybe they get more points than your 10 get because 8 of them get about 80% as many points as you get, and the other 2 of them get 5 times the number of points as your people get. Mm-hmm. And so my group as a whole has more points in it than your group as a whole.
Right.
So that kind of thing exists. There's multiple studies. You can go learn about them. It's pretty fascinating. I am presently unaware of known perfectly stable group strategies that beat tit for tat. But there's a lot of strategic instability that exists. That's where cooperation games get interesting, because cooperation games are extremely strategically stable, because the characteristics of a cooperation game is that deviating from the general consensus harms the deviator.
Okay. I think an example would be helpful.
What side of the street do you drive on?
I go with the right side lately.
Yeah. Why?
Otherwise, I risk running into somebody, or the cops coming after me, or just having a bad day.
Yeah. There you go. What side of the street you drive on is a cooperation game.
Yep, the right side.
There's some places where they drive on the left. I've seen people make fairly outsized claims about how much better it is to drive on the left than it is to drive on the right. Maybe that's true. I don't really know. There's also a historical story about how knights interacted with each other on continental Europe versus England. And that's why we drive on one side or the other. It's down to whether or not you're more dangerous or more safe when you encounter strangers on the road.
With the right hand.
Yeah. I'm not sure about any of that either, but At the end of the day, you drive on the same side of the street that everybody else drives on because that's what's safe to do. If you're the
Right.
only person that deviates, like you said, oncoming traffic becomes a very big problem for you particularly. Uh,
Yeah.
it probably becomes a big problem for some other poor soul as well.
Right. But statistically, very few of that
Right.
side of the
Yes. Yes. Yes.
choice.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You're
Okay.
very definitely going to take the hit on
Yeah.
this decision.
And that group is going to be 0.00001% is going to take a hit.
Right.
Okay.
So deviating from general consensus is something that basically doesn't happen in coordination games because the deviators basically are breeding themselves out of the game. That they'll take the
Right.
hits, they won't be able to come back strong the next time around. So this is sort of perfect for machines because we get exactly what we're looking for. When they comply with what we're going for, we get more of it. When they discomply with what we're going for, we can shuffle them off to the side. Problem: the world's not a static place. So we need systems, particularly sort of decision making, thinking, reasoning systems that can that always adhere very tightly to whatever it is that they're adhering to, but also have the flexibility to learn new things and try to move to better outcomes. And so this is where we now put in a secondary structure of the negotiation game. Effectively, what we do is we figure out how to price moving the point of common consensus.
Okay.
So, given the existence of a consensus point, which a consensus point might be a very simple decision like what side, a binary like what side of the street you drive on. It might be some incredibly
Right.
complex set of decisions, and the math gets more and more difficult to cope with the more and more complex decisions we're coping with are. But once we've identified that, then we can start changing again the bits back to Shannon entropy. We can change those decisions bit by bit, and every bit in the decision chain has some value attached to it to being changed. And so by effectively charging the change cost to somebody with an outsized proposal, we can create a new consensus point that we can then evaluate in light of the previous consensus point to work out whether or not the participants at the new consensus are getting as many hypothetical points as they used to be getting to figure out. So the notion then is to converge the cost of movement and the value of movement so that when people pay to make the world a better place, they are rewarded out of the better place that the world becomes as a result of their innovation. When they pay to make the world a worse place, they are punished out of the worse place that the world becomes as a result of their action, and that punishment needs to be at least large enough to pay to repair the damage that was
Damage.
done by
Right.
by setting that up. And so
So the goal here is consensus, but where that consensus lies is going to be based on what the populace chooses with these models. Is that right?
uh not really. So the goal is where consensus lies. The goal is
Uh-huh.
to structure that house in a way that makes it mathematically tractable so that we can understand what's moving. So the The consensus is essentially what allows us to have something that's comprehensible to latch onto to understand what's moving. And
Right.
so by having multiple players and multiple points of view within our system that are being forced into this game that is designed so that consensus is all that there is, or not all that there is, but attempting to go away from consensus is going to rapidly sort of push you out to the edge.
Punish.
Yes,
Right.
we're exploiting that structural fact of this mathematical structure to understand the evolution of a point of common understanding within a framework that we can actually comprehend.
Measure.
Measure.
Comprehend.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Because if you go off and train a program to read MRIs, and Jack over there goes off and trains another program to read MRIs, and we go do the research, and both of your things are doing better than people, which one of you has a better one? I don't know. You don't know. Jack doesn't know. How are they better? Why are they better? Like.
Right. So I'm curious to use a real world example just to kind of play this out. Let me know if this doesn't make sense, but I'm thinking about one that we already as a species, as a human species, and as a nation in the U.S. have a trouble with alignment. And so I'm thinking if we bring AI into this, the alignment could be anywhere. And I'm thinking about some problem like, let's say, abortion. And really, abortion comes down to, is it legal, is it not? And I think you could extrapolate that to number of days since conception. I think that would probably be a somewhat valid measure. So some groups say 0. No abortion is allowed no matter how many days there is. And some say, I don't know. I doubt anybody says 9 months, but there's an upper end.
There are actual advocates for post-birth abortion. It is
okay.
It's pretty horrifying, but
yeah.
10,000.
Well, let's yeah. I would think that 5 years post birth would be considered murder. But okay, so
I would hope,
let's say somewhere
but
between.
Some people
hopefully, are nuts.
Yes.
Okay.
Some people are nuts.
They will get pushed. They will get pushed out of
right.
the edge, as you say, really fast. But let's say 0 to 365. Now, how could we? Is there a practical way to take this kind of real world problem and put it into this methodology you're describing?
So under those kinds of circumstances, it's obviously highly contentious. But there's one way that you can effectively develop these consensuses within themselves, and that's by basically making movements increase costs. So let's say we were going to pick a number between 0 and 365. And so we would basically start with an arbitrary number. And while this might seem to be biased in one direction or another, because of the structure of how this works, the bias sort of goes away very quickly. So we'd take the middle of the range, 183, say, and just set the system to be 183. And then the people within that system would have some sort of, urgent credit, if you will, where they could make their opinion known by paying that number down. But by paying the number down, what they're doing, or up, they're using up their ability to change things, and they're raising the cost of moving it. Moving back across something that's already moved now has a higher cost involved. And so what you could do is take a sampling group of people that would decide sort of how much of their political capital they wanted to expend on this question. you could embed it in a wider set of political interests. So maybe somebody cares a lot about this. Maybe somebody doesn't care a lot about this and wants to
Oh,
spend
so that
more.
there's a weight. What's the economic term? There's a
Yeah,
alternative use of this money or this currency.
this currency. Yeah,
So
this
it has meaning to you.
right. Yeah, um, yeah. So there's an opportunity cost
Opportunity cost.
of its utilization.
Right.
And so what you would do is um, basically you could take on these samples of people that are in this system that are moving their political capital, and as they move it, you could increase the cost of sort of moving back and allow that system to reach whatever its equilibrium is.
Mm-hmm.
And that number may well tend to one extreme or the other. I could see a world where it had been driven to zero, um, producing many children who were happy to live in a world where they weren't aborted, and
Yeah.
you know, utilizing their own political capital to reverse attempts to remove, or a world where it went off the other extreme as well. But
Mm-hmm.
within a structure like that, you can sort of begin to see a fairly simple way. For a radically less contentious example, imagine project management. So
Mm-hmm.
you're working for some large company, you have an important project, you've got a basic timeline that you want it to get done by. You could set up a betting pool on when the project was going to get finished. And that betting pool could be extremely low stakes, like $1 a day or something. So it's not worth anybody's time or effort to sabotage the project to win a bet.
Right.
But it's still, it's you've got some downtime, you see something, it's worth spending a little money to get a little bit back on the other end.
Uh-huh.
And under those circumstances, you could again move the date. So if one day you're the executive and you wake up and your project just had 40 years added to it, apparently people think that it's worth $12,000+ to to get
Move that out.
this guaranteed return that's going to be happening. Maybe you should look into whatever changed overnight to see what's going to happen with that.
Where's the return? Like if I spend $1 to say push it out by 3 days, and I turn out to be right, what do I get back?
So here's where this particular model gets fun. Let's say you were going to do $1 a day, and you picked some arbitrary date, like a year and a half from now, for when this project was supposed to get finished.
Right.
Since people can bet the price up or down, and it's $1 either way, if you bet the price up by a day and I bet the price down by a day, effectively we're just going to pay each other off. We didn't move the price at all, and whichever one of us turns out to be correct will get paid by the other person. So we have no effect. So as an executive using this system, your total cost of funding of this system is simply $1 per day of your initial error. So if you bid it out to a year and a half, and it winds up taking a year and a half, it winds up costing you no money to have an ongoing monitoring system as opinions sort of shuffle back and forth. If you turn out to be wrong by a couple of weeks, it winds up costing you $14, $15 to be wrong by a couple of weeks. If you wind up being wrong by a couple of years, $700 or so to be wrong by a couple of years.
Okay, and then the individuals in this game, it's like a betting pool. So if I turn out to be right, I'm going to get a little bit from other people who were wrong.
Right, which includes ultimately the the supervisor that set the thing up in the first place. And
Okay.
and once
And the
again,
goal here is to get to a consensus that's also correct on the date when this project will ship.
the goal here is to provide a communications mechanism that's trustable for the executive. So they're paying to build a
Okay.
system that will inform them from a very wide variety of people without having to, like, go out to everybody's cubicle and get a relationship and figure out.
Right.
So you're
And uh they're motivated to get the right answer because they'll get paid out.
presumably, yes, that they own the company, or are being paid based on how well the company's operating. We're living in fantasy land here, so.
Yeah. I don't know. I can believe this.
But
And you mentioned that the earlier you vote, the more sway you have. Is that partly because, like in this example, the further down we go, the less, from like a Bayesian perspective, the less influence you have.
Well,
forward in time.
so in this model, we could actually make it completely static because there's an external valuing process. So because the executive is going to kick in for whatever's going on, it doesn't matter whether you're early or late to this game. The difference is that if you have information that you sit on in this game, then somebody else might provide that information or equivalent information, because the executive only cares about where the date winds up. If you know that it's going to be delayed because Sam's kid just got cancer, and Alice down the hall knows it's going to be delayed because this design that Sam came up with is moronic and is just not going to work, both of you are correct. It is going to get delayed, and if you're both basically right about how much it gets delayed, then from the executive points of view, all this human story stuff doesn't actually matter in terms of this particular outcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. But from the individual's perspective, I could see this being non-static. Just as the days go by, maybe a recession hits, and that changes the how many people you can hire.
Absolutely, those sorts of things. You thought everything was going hunky dory, and then you open up the first box from the subcontractor, and what's in it, and you're like. This is as good as the bolts are. All of my estimates were completely crap. We have to start over again. Stuff like that.
Right.
And again, this could be made multidimensional. You could track the cost in addition to the days. You could track manpower allocation and team growth, and start looking at what the day by days would look like. So you could build out this sort of model of having a relatively high dimensional sort of project managery dashboard that was also a Oracle betting site that people would actually be able to sort of provide future information to you in a way that was economically efficient.
So pulling this up to the AI, or to the alignment with the AI, what would this look like?
Well, once you have systems like this, we can plug AIs straight into them. So imagine
As just more individuals.
right, imagine developing AIs, multiple AIs that would read the company's data logs and bet inside the system. There's probably some kind of connection between the sequence of security badge swipes at the front door and the rate at which money is spent on, and you certainly aren't going to figure out what that is, but if it's practical to figure out what that is, some of these generative AI technologies are the sorts of things that would figure out what those things are, and to the degree that they could be rewarded for continuing whatever it is that they're doing that's working, you would create an aligned AI system. Effectively, you have to build the alignment on the front end, and then you can build systems that are training themselves to be aligned, and then those become useful tools that are available for our use.
Okay, so in a way, is the purpose of this to discover I don't know if correlation is the right word, maybe causal links. So if number of badge swipes against, the how the next quarter report will do at Microsoft would be an interesting thing to discover, because you probably could get away with using it without anybody ever knowing, and you'd have a little bit of insight into the stock market. Are we really exposing causalities?
In some cases, yes. And speaking in terms of the stock market, the next stage of this is actually developing marketplaces that don't have an exogenous interest, but are instead worked into themselves, which that might be part 2, or part 3, or whatever the next phase of this turns out to be.
Of alignment.
Of aligning superintelligence. But I had a conversation with some guys that bought 10% of U.S. location data. They knew 10% of where everybody in the United States was from the year 2000 to the year like 2015.
Okay. It's a little freaky.
Yeah. Well, it's fine. They were recent college graduates. They're exactly the kind of people you would trust with this information. And they were just buying it from people who also had this information. Like they were just making a very big pile of it, but that was by gathering together lots of other very big piles that already existed.
Right.
And I had a conversation with them of, could you imagine that there's some sort of connection between where everybody is every day and the stock market?
Yeah.
I'd imagine there's probably some kind of connection between those two things.
I understand that people will even look where private jets are going because it implies mergers.
Yeah. Well, another point, one of our occasionally world's richest men, Elon Musk, owns a platform now delightfully called X that not only knows where most of America is from moment to moment every day, but what's on their mind.
Right.
Could you
They volunteer
imagine
that info.
some sort of connection between what everybody is doing and thinking and the economy? I mean, maybe there's no relationship.
But it's highly likely there is.
It seems like there ought to be one.
Yeah.
So the precursors are here already, and AIs being plugged into these systems are here already. What is not here already is a mature and public discussion about how to set up these alignment systems so that they work when we plug these data streams and AIs into them, because we are already plugging them into the ones that don't work when we do this.
Is how close? What is our current voting system missing? How do we get from where we are with voting every individual who's a U.S. citizen over 18 in other conditions, not a felony, doesn't have a felony conviction, whatever other rules we have, you get one per person. That's sort of like this currency you're saying, but it's kind of blunt, and it's only once every 4 years or once every 2 years or something.
So there's a guy named Kenneth Arrow who got the Econ Nobel back in the early 70s, maybe even 1970, for something called Arrow's impossibility theorem. And he came up with 5 traits of a coherent executive nomination system that would exist. And they're pretty non-controversial. There are things like third parties shouldn't change the outcome of an election if they don't have any chance. And if you're familiar at all with ranked choice voting, ranked choice voting gets after one of the primary weaknesses, in fact, that specific primary weakness of our first past the post system. What Kenneth Arrow got the Econ Nobel for was discovering that these 5 broadly non-controversial requirements of a coherent executive nomination decision process is that there's nothing. It's impossible to satisfy all 5 requirements simultaneously. So any
Uh-huh.
group of at least 3 people making decisions where there's more than 2 options behaves incoherently. Period.
Wow. Okay. So how does this not break everything?
Well, as I've continually pointed out on this show and others, everything is broken.
Okay.
Period.
But I can get up and I can go buy milk and I can get gas and something
Today,
seems to be working here today. Yeah, at the moment.
we
So you're saying it's a we're in a temporary okayness,
right, yeah.
but
People could wake up in the morning and buy milk in the Middle Ages, and if your entire goal around being human is that you wake up and in the course of the day you're gonna have some fun, eat something, maybe have some sex, and go to sleep at night, then there's no meaningful difference between being Jeff Bezos and being a Neolithic tribesman on an island in the South
uh-huh,
Pacific. Like
uh-huh,
both of those, or a chimpanzee.
uh-huh, uh-huh.
Uh, you know, there's wolves that live like that.
Right, right, right.
So whether or not we're going to have civilization depends on whether or not we're going to generate institutions that allow civilization to exist. And the institutions that we have, that we're visibly watching break, worked because we were all people. And 90-ish% of us have consciences, and we're asleep most of the time, or at least some of the time. Like we had our own limitations that these robots do not share. uh, and
Yeah.
much like as a computer programmer, you're quite familiar with things that seem reasonable at the scale at which you operate become
Yeah.
suddenly entirely non-reasonable when they're being done millions of times a second. Um, the same thing
Right.
applies. And so,
Uh-huh.
first past the post voting was more or less decent at running industrial economies, uh,
Right.
but we have an information economy now, and we have to cope with the fact that large scale groups are necessarily going to be incoherent. And so what we need is systems that strive for a valuable consensus and are flexibly capable of recovering from error, because error is inevitable, because it's mathematically
Right.
impossible to construct a system that will avoid it.
I wonder too if one of the challenges with the voting is just the frequency of time and how it's done. I mean, right now it's who has the most commercials and if the economy happens to be good. It's not based on much beyond that. Also, you tend to vote for a package, right? I vote for Republican or Democrat. I don't vote for an abortion decision or and the people tend to aggregate to those. But I also wonder if they have a tribe mentality that aggregates that moves them toward that.
There's extremely powerful tribe mentalities. You're also missing the fact that they vote for people.
Uh,
The
yeah,
politicians really are,
yeah,
like
yeah.
Genghis Khan didn't murder millions of people because he was Kal-El, come from Krypton, and was just physically impervious to harm. Uh,
Yeah.
he had a charisma and a concept of planning and a force of will that allowed him to attract groups around him. Powerful people exist, and by definition, they can do enormous harm should they choose to do so. And
Right.
so, having a political system that constrains them is valuable. And that's where first past the post shines, because at least it eliminates most of the contenders.
I see. And actually, that may step into a question I had about. Um, so we can imagine a system where one vote per person per day or something like that. But with AI, is this just how do you get one vote per CPU, one vote per? This goes back to the old days of troubles with how do we do licensing pricing.
Well, that's where if we can structure systems using these coordination game, negotiation game systems, then the value of opinions becomes reinforced over time by the past value
Okay.
of those opinions. And so, um, under that circumstance, the AIs can only gain traction to the degree that they're providing measurable histories of improvement of the system outcome.
So the actual sizing of number of votes and weight of votes, or whatever it is, per unit intelligence would itself converge to a value.
Exactly. And it doesn't matter what that value is because the entire structure is around improving the outcome. So then it becomes about how you structure what outcome improvement is. You could have outcome improvement be defined by the well-being of the least among us, a very sort of Christian point of view, if you will.
Right.
You could have it be some sort of averaging of either the arithmetic mean or the median or some other kind of measure or the mode. The
Would who would choose this weighting function? Could that itself be chosen by this system, or did we get into some sort of a weird chicken and egg problem?
you can pile these things on top of each other. The difficulty of piling them up becomes hyper exponentially more complex the more complex the underlying information source goes. But the value proposition of this particular approach is that it becomes possible to quantitatively declare what the value proposition actually being offered is. So OpenAI,
Right.
for example, will I'll let you give them money in order to access their full system. What does their full system do? Well, they don't know. Uh,
Right. Yeah.
so there's a very plausible story to tell that they are engaging in the commission of fraud because they're claiming something that you're gaining value when there's absolutely no way for them to make that assertion.
Right.
This is a
That's probably true of almost any marketer.
that is very much the case. And again, with computers sort of really highlighting how much easier communication is, the fact of large-scale fraud being relatively dominant in our space. I remember I saw a recent interview. There's a YouTube channel called CoffeeZilla, and there's another guy named Patrick something, and so they're both hilarious. They both catch frauds on YouTube, and the Patrick guy was talking to somebody who's written a book about financial frauds or something to recommend the book and so on, and he was talking to this CoffeeZilla person about how this guy had done his first expose and sort of thought to himself, well, I guess I'm done now. I revealed fraud on the internet, and I won't have a channel anymore because there couldn't be more fraud on the internet. And now he has this, million,
Channel,
million subscriber channel, making 7 or 8 figures, who knows, doing these well-produced people ripping each other off types of videos. That's very much what's happening. On the political sphere, one very strong possibility that high degree communication gives us, and once we understand that coherence isn't an option no matter what we do, would be radically increasing the number of jury decision making that occurs. And so that would get to several of the points you raised. It would do greater sampling rates. If people were being asked to be on juries a few times a year, then it would be significantly more personal. The downside of general jurying is, of course, that it's highly incoherent. One particular jury and another particular jury might completely disagree with one another.
Disagree.
But
Right.
because incoherence is the only option, and we have the mathematical proof thanks to Mr. Arrow, maybe that's just the price we have to pay for being people and not robots.
Right. Odd to say when the robots are coming.
Right.
So we're out of time for this episode. We're clearly going to need a third, because if the AGI is coming, and we don't have an alignment system built between us humans, we kind of need to get that built so when the AGI comes, we can plug it in. Everybody look forward to a next installment of the alignment problem.
Absolutely.